In today's video, we are going to see the frictional properties of agricultural produce. Myself is Dr. Sugita, faculty from SNS College of Technology. This is a part of 23 AGT 207 Engineering Properties of Agricultural Produce. In the previous units, we have been discussing about the physical properties as well as the thermal properties and their applications in handling the agricultural produce. Frictional property comes under the thermal property, and in frictional property, the angle of repose finds a major implication in handling of agricultural produce. We can see what is an angle of repose and how to measure the angle of repose and what are the applications of angle of repose in this video. What is angle of repose? The angle of repose is the angle between the horizontal and the sloping side of a pipe. So in your childhood, you might have played with a paper funnel, maybe filled with the sand, and you may be allowing the sand to flow so that it can form a pile. The same thing is applicable if you handle the agriculture produce, especially the post-harvest handling, the floor of any material. So the piling nature is common here also. When you pile or heap produce, it forms the angle of repose. So in this picture, it is well denoted that angle of repose is the angle between the horizontal and the sloping side of a pile of any granular material when you pour or dropped onto a surface. So what does it represent? It is the measure of the material's flowability. So how the material's flowability influence the post-harvest handling, we will see in the later slides. How you can measure the angle of repose. So angle of repose can be measured by a facility like this. It is measured with a square box in which you have to fill the material of interest to the top. Then you have to remove the lid and you have to allow the granular material to fall freely so that it results in a conical shape of the sample. So in this structure, you can find a scale for measuring. There is a base holder and there is a circular base, a transparent face as well as a stand. By measuring the base as well as the height of the cone form, you can calculate the angle of repose. The formula is given as theta is equal to tan inverse of h by r. Very simple formula which is represented usually as the inverse of tan. What is h here? That is the height of the pile. And what is r? That is the horizontal radius or base length by 2 for a symmetric pile. There are three properties we have to remember while studying the angle of repose. One is the static angle of friction, that is the angle of friction which is taken up by any granular solid material when it slides upon itself. Here the angle of repose depends upon the size, shape as well as the moisture content also plays a major role in angle of repose. Suppose if a product is having more moisture content, what happens? The weight will be more, the mass will be more. When the moisture content is less, it is more towards the dried stage and the movement will be influenced by this. The dynamic angle of repose arises when the bulk of the material, when it is in a motion, that is in the moving phase. There is an important term called as coefficient of friction, mu. It is denoted as mu. What is coefficient of friction? It is the measure of how much frictional force exists between two surfaces in contact. One may be the plate and another may be your product of interest. So it depends on the material of the surfaces and can be either. There are two types of coefficient of friction. One is static coefficient of friction, that is μs, and another one is kinetic coefficient of friction, which is denoted by μk. So μs is measured when the object is at rest, whereas μk, that is the coefficient of friction, is measured when the object is in motion. But these two properties are very important depending upon the material of the surface or either. How it is calculated? One method is using an inclined plane method. So everyone knows an inclined plane, right? So if you are working with an inclined plane, you can work out the coefficient of friction using the formula mu is equal to tan function of theta. So already we know what is theta. Theta is the angle at which an object just starts to slide. So you can remember an inclined plane here. And if you roll a ball in an inclined plane, at one stage it comes to rest at the bottom, or it forms an angle. The same way, when you use a inclined plane for movement of the object, here also the object will flow throughout this inclined plane, and you have to measure the angle where it just starts to slide down. And the second is using friction force formula. The coefficient of friction is given by a simple formula, that is mu is equal to Ff by Fn. So here the two forces you have to take into account. One is the friction force and another is the normal force. So here it is given as the ratio of the friction force as well as normal force. Both are measured in newtons. So remember, there are two ways you can calculate the coefficient of friction. One is by the inclined plane method, another one is by the friction force formula, where in both the methods the formulas are quite different. In inclined plane, you are measuring the angle where the object just starts to slide before getting into rest, whereas in case of friction force formula, you are taking into account the two types of force acting on that material, that is the friction force as well as normal force. Now you have a question. What is the application of this frictional property, that is the angle of repose? Why I have to study the angle of repose? So it is having wide application in post-harvest handling as well as in agricultural engineering. So in agricultural engineering, the angle of repose is crucial for designing the silos. What do you mean by silos? Silos is nothing but a setup to preserve the fodder crops, tanks and hoppers for storing and transporting your grain, seed or any bulk agriculture product, even in the flour, wheat flour or rice flour, any type of millet flour. In case of handling the material, that is the post-harvest handling, based on the flowability. So already I explained this angle of repose is a measure of the flowability, how easily the material can able to flow. So it is used to determine the dimension of hoppers in rice mill or in any grinding mills. You might have seen the hoppers. So this property is used to determine or design the dimension of hoppers, chutes as well as the conveyor belt for efficiently handling these granular materials. So far we have studied the angle of repose. So what is angle of repose? It is the angle between the horizontal base and the inclined side of the object when it is allowed to fall to form a pipe. So what is the formula here? Theta is equal to tan inverse of h by r. And we also study the coefficient of friction. It can be measured by two methods. One is the inclined plane method. Another one is the friction force formula, where you have to take into account the friction force and the normal force. And what are the application of this angle of repose in agriculture, especially for handling the produce, post-harvest handling, to design the hoppers, tubes as well as the conveyor, and for handling the granular materials. Thank you. I will meet you with another video series, lecture series in the next video. Thank you.